far away from home, no matter from where are you coming, from far or from close. Please be welcome. Today I want to preach on a topic which is very important, but oftentimes it's neglected in our lives. And I want to preach on a topic of complaining or murmuring. It's a time for children to be, dismissed. Children, we love you, but Jesus loves you more. So it's a time for a Sunday school.
There is no big kids class today because our teacher's not here. So the big kids will still be like. Sorry, guys.
Okay, be welcome to join us. So as I mentioned, I will preach on a topic of complaining. The constant complaining seems like a favorite pastime for many of us. We complain about the weather, how we don't know what clothes to wear. We complain about food, which doesn't fulfill our expectations. We complain about the working space, about the boss, colleagues, salary, our income. We complain about country what we live in. We complain about the people, culture, traffic. It became almost impossible to have a conversation with a friend in which he or us would not complain about something. Today, complaining is a widely accepted norm. Oftentimes, it's encouraged and supported by the culture, and even became a daily lifestyle of communication. For some, the first complaint begins with a breakfast, and for others, complaining starts much earlier in the day. Only by hearing the alarm clock sparks objection for many of us that we need to wake up early. I guess we all know a person who always complains, who says, nothing ever goes in my way. Every time I order something, it's always messed up. This person is never happy, has something always negative to say. The struggle to be content, it's not a new concept. Thousands of years ago, God's people fought the same battle we do today, just looked a little bit different. Let us not be surprised that we aren't the first generation which is dealing with this problem. In the book of Numbers, we have a historical writing in which Israelites are complaining, grumbling, and God's anger kindles towards them. Complaining or grumbling, it's not something which exclusively belongs to a 21st century. That is a part of our fallen nature. Nature which has a tendency to not be content. Grumbling seems like a small thing, but it's a sign that gratitude, that thankfulness is missing. Whenever unbelief and lack of thankfulness marks the lives of God's children, consequences are inevitable. In today's text, we will see how this sin would bring one of the greatest tragedy in the history of God's people in the time of the Old Testament. And maybe we wonder what a life lesson you and I can learn from this text. I would like to invite you in reading in the book of Numbers, 11th chapter, verses 1 to 9. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had a meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now, the manna was like a coriander seed, and its appearance like of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in a hand mills or beat it in a mortars and boil it in pots and make it cakes of it. And the taste of it was like taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. So this is the transition point in the book of Numbers. And what do I mean, transition point? To this very moment, Israel is faithful to God. Till this point, they do everything according to the law. And as we are coming to the 11th chapter, and we read verse number 1, verse which surprised many of us, because for you and I, as we read this story, there is some things that the original reader will easy to understand. But for us, we have to do a little additional research to understand the background of this text. From a simple reason, because we don't live in that time, in that place right now. So, first, the people of Israel have encamped in the Mount of Sinai. They spent about 11 months there. Something what this area is known, it's a fertile soil. Well, this is not an extremely fertile soil or like an agricultural area, but at least there are some trees which are providing a shade. What is most important, there is water and there is fertile land. Soil in which you can plant something, grow something, and you can have food. So the nation of Israel, in this kind of environment, would not have any struggle to survive. But now, God in His wisdom have called His own people to follow Him from fertile land into a dry desert. Now they are in open desert, open sky. It's nearly impossible to find the water and food except for the manna, which they are eating for a days. So the geography by itself, it's telling us a story. They walk from tough to tougher, from bad to worse. From this we will see that it will be gonna be a tough journey. It will be a sun and very hot. It will be a dry, it will be very dusty. It will be very, very uncomfortable. So the nation to sustain under those circumstances, it's a humanly impossible. So God supernaturally sustained them. Something what I want you to notice from the text is that following God did not bring them easy, comfort, and everything what they want. Following God bring them from a difficult to even more difficult circumstances. The scripture is rich in examples where people obey the will of God. They follow His commandments, and it did not lead them to easy and comfort, but leads them to more difficult situations. Let me give you one example of few. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, we can see the disciples being in the center of God's will. And they found themselves in a tremendous storm just by following the commandment of Jesus. I think the book of Numbers opposes the idea that if I follow God, that everything is going to be easy, everything is going to be in my life how I want to be. Obeying God in chapter 11 means you move from fertile land to a dry desert. So that is what it means for Israel. With that in mind, I think a lot of us have expectations that I give my life to the Lord. If I fully committed my life to God, that my health gonna be better. I will have a dream job. I will have a dream position, dream career, dream house. You just put a dream before any word. Obedience to God oftentimes leads from difficult to worst. But be not surprised, brothers and sisters, that if we follow God, it will lead us to some very difficult things in life. But this is the key. God sustained the nation of Israel through difficult times as He will sustain us. Let me ask one quick question. And let's all think about this. Why God called his people from a fertile land into a dry desert? Or with other words, from a place of abundance into a place of no water and food. Why he called them? God wants to be the only source of sustainability for his own people. The only source of life and strength that sustain us while we travel in a desert land. He wants to be only source in which we depend on that journey. When you travel through a desert land, you are not alone. You are traveling with God, who can and will sustain you. He sustained the nation of Israel, feeding them with manna. He will sustain you and I, feeding us with his holy word. His food has all nutrients that our soul needs on the way to heaven. His word gives life, because man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Dear brothers and sisters, like people of Israel, we too have to set on a journey, not to Canaan, but to heaven. God has given us wonderful promises. Let us not presume upon his provision or grumble about the road he leads us, but instead be filled with a gratitude for all what he has done and doing for us. If we carefully read the previous chapters of Numbers, starting from chapter 1 going to chapter 11, it's so hard to not notice one verse which is repeated all over and over again, and that is the next verse. For example, you can find it first chapter, verse 54. And the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so did they. Numbers 154. And maybe we wonder what happens with them. Why this verse? It's not a description for God's people in the 11th chapter. What's the reason for their rebellion against God? Let's read the verse 1. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. So, after God delivered them from a slavery in Egypt, the Israelites received his law, where he was given his commandments, and they knew their destination, they knew where they are going. They eagerly set out to reach to the promised land, but they hadn't gone so far. Barely around the first bend on the road, they begin to complain. When God's people ask for a food in the desert, God literally rained down bread from heaven. Isn't this wonderful indication of God's love for his own people? But over the time, this miraculous became a mundane. Israel had all they need. God gave them direction and protection, and he took care of their physical and spiritual needs. And yet, they wanted meat to eat instead of manna. Even wished to get back to Egypt. Sometimes we can be like the Israelites, complain about the same things what we used to celebrate. Dear brothers and sisters, complaining creates a resistance for the things that God is doing in our lives. God has blessed us and given us everything what we need. And if we don't recognize the good things, we will never be content. So let's put this in perspective. Those people are complaining about the necessity of life. They are dried up, as text is saying. They are grumbling because they are eating the same food day after day. They are grumbling because they are losing strength, they are losing their appetite. If those people grumble over the necessity of life, for what do we grumble over? We complain over someone did not greet us today and how we feel hurt about that. We complain about the church equipment, the computer is slow, not necessary. Or how long time we wait in the bank. We complain how sales lady in the market serves someone ahead of us. To not mention the long waiting on the red light. We complain that we are not put in office with coffee and donuts, and that the church is doing something and you don't like it. And we complain about things which are less significant than the essentials. And God brings down fire to warn them about their complaining. From this, we should realize that complaining brings a divine displeasure to the Lord. This text was not only written for the people of Israel, but also it's warning to us, because we have the same virus in our bloodstream. As the ancient Israelites, we are natural complainers. Look how seriously God looks on complaining. The biblical author Moses could write anything here. He could write like the Israelites were moved by immorality and God's anger kindled toward them. Or they steal from each other, they kill each other, they lie each other, and God was angry to them and his anger burst. But none of those things, but complaining, kindled the wrath of God. That is what brought the judgment of God upon his people. Do you know how long they have been walking in the desert until this point? How long it has been? It's 3 days. Is it amazing? 400 years they lived in captivity, and just 3 days to start complaining? And as I thought of myself in my own life, I'm far quicker to complain. I complain in a minute right away if they complain after 3 days. The smallest little thing can ruin our Thanksgiving. Someone says something to you and you're crushed in the spirit. And we found out that the smallest little thing keeps us away from giving thanks to the Lord. A very small thing can cause us complaint. So what are the characteristics of complaining? What is complaining looks like? How we can recognize it? First of all, it's irrational and it's somehow without sense. So what do I mean by that? The first verse is saying, people of the Lord complain about their misfortune. And we ask, what misfortune? Everything has gone perfectly so far. They haven't really had any serious misfortunes. I suppose that must mean the hardships of living in the desert. And they moved, interestingly, but please pay attention to this, from dissatisfaction in present to nostalgic in the past. It's a winning combination for depression. The verse 4 and 5 are telling us, we remember the fish in Egypt, the cucumbers, melon, but now we have nothing but this manna. Those are the good old days. You remember people talking good old days? Egypt is where we have it easy. Oh, how wonderful Egypt was. Oh, how awful present is. Really? Nothing was free in Egypt. And as we are listening, we hardly believe on our ears. Egypt was a place of slavery, place of oppression, cruelty, hard labor, cruel taskmasters, murders of little children. They were crying, they were longing to be delivered. Egypt was a horrible place. They call it a house of bondage, but they have forgotten all that. All they remember, it was the food. What about their view of present? We have nothing but this man. They complained when they minimized what they did have. So how in the world could fish, onion and garlic be compared with manna which was delivered fresh from the hands of God. In verse 7 to 9, we are told this manna was most wonderful food that man ever tried. It was abundant. It only need to be picked up and eaten without to work for it. It can be cooked in many ways. You can boil it, you can bake it. It was delicious. The taste, we are told, it's like the taste of cake, pastry, sweet as honey, pastry baked with oil. In the Psalms, it's called the bread of heaven. As you see, this complaining, it's irrational. It's a hike of ingratitude. And often is that what happens to us when we complain. We look the past through a rose-colored glasses, quite unrealistically. The good old days weren't nearly good and old as we know and imagine them to be. And we look at the present through a dark glasses, equally unfair. And makes no sense. Do we become a people who aren't able to count our present blessings? Why we can't see how much God has blessed us? So the complaining is irrational. When we read verse 5, someone says, what about melon? What about fish? What about cucumbers, garlic? Why isn't some of them stand up and say, but what about men who were forcibly taking our women? What about those who were killing our children? What about those whips who bled our back till we make it bricks? They remember all good things in Egypt, which they were few, and they have forgotten the difficult things, which were a lot. Complaining made us to have a selective memory. Secondly, complaining is infectious, and it's transmitted easy and very frequently. Complaining is not like a domino effect. It's more like a contagious disease. As one catches complaining, someone else catches it. Apparently begins with a one person and stretch out to entire camp. Just one person looking in other and saying, this is not good. Why do we came here? Why I'm here? I would have done this so differently. Or if I could be on position, would be far more different. And that complaining kindled the wrath of God. Let's go down in the text, verse 4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. Now, who are those rebel, or in other translation call them mixed multitude? This is a reference to all non-Israelites who have left Egypt with people of God. In Exodus 12:38 we read, many other went with them out of Egypt. They were walking with God's people on their journey to the promised land, but seems they never accepted or understand their commitment to God. They really never been a part of God's people at all. So this little group start, and all the way this solo number became congregational and transformed them from a thankful nation into a nation of complaining and murmuring. So complaining started with them, then it spread to the people throughout the clans. Then we found out Moses is complaining. Then in chapter 12 we found out Miriam and Aaron complaining. Then in chapter 13 we found people are not willing to believe the reports of the spies about the promised land. Then in chapter 14 will be the final disastrous rebellion. So complaining starts small, but it's infectious and it spreads like a wild fire and becomes worse and worse. So what we need to realize is this: to be careful with whom we spend our time. Avoid people who are chronic complainers. They won't help you. They will drag you down. They will spread that virus to you. What I'm not saying is this: This is not a reason for us to not witness them, to not pray for them, to not reach those people, but to be aware of those conversations, which can make us easy to be complainer. And also, to not tame each other with our complaining. Let us not allow our bitterness to overflow and become other people's bitterness. A complaining can spoil the whole workspace. It can divide a team. Men start being negative, critical, and it spreads to others. Complaining can spoil the family, and complaining can ruin a church. There are many reasons why churches split over no biblical issues. I read a story on the internet about congregation splitting over the color of the carpet, and I realized how easy the enemy can work against the unity in the church just because you or I prefer other color of carpet. For many of us, murmuring is a small thing, but it's a lot more damaging than many people realize. This kind of behavior kindled the wrath of God. When the Apostle Paul wrote letter to the early church, in 1 Corinthians 10 chapter, verses 10 to 11, he said this, "Nor grumbled, and some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." In the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, he said this, "Do all things, without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as the lights of the world." So, complaining lives in a heart when thankfulness is absent. I believe we all know at least one person who always finds the mistakes in everybody. And I know many. And oftentimes I am one of them. I am tired, brothers and sisters, for looking of imperfection all around me. And I am wondering how I can be a joyful person. So what's the cure for complaining? How I can be content? There is only one word, and that is thankfulness. 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 to 18. "Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." So if you wonder what is a will of God for my life, is to give thanks in all circumstances. And those all circumstances include the circumstances that you and I doesn't like them. Let me share one story with you that I shared before. When we was in Philippines with my wife, we supposed to visit a dear family. They had 10 children. And you go nowhere with empty hands. My wife said we should buy gifts for them. No, to buy gifts, but there are 10 children, I said. So what should we do? We go to the market and she bought a slice of bread. Oh, this is embarrassing, I said, how we will visit this family with giving them slice of bread. Let's buy chocolates and toys for the children. No bread and you will see. We came in their house and we spread the bread among the children. I haven't seen a greater joy. They were jumping, screaming, shouting, hugging us. Those children were not poor. They had more than I have, they have thankfulness. And by the way, this is well-situated family. In their context, they are rich people. From those children, I realized that the joy, it's a gift for a thankful heart. So, what's the problem with us today? What's the problem with our children, with youth? What's our greatest problem? Not having the newest iPhone, PlayStation, Nintendo? Not having expensive shoes, clothes? Not our greatest problem, it's absence of thankfulness. Complaint leads to a thirsting for more and more. And thankfulness leads to joy. Dear brothers and sisters, when we constantly complain, we are forgetting that God can turn any situation, any circumstances into a blessings for His own people. When we are murmuring, we tend to forget that all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Romans 8:28. Isn't this enough to thank God for the things what we most of the time we complain? Instead to spend the time murmuring, let us praise God for everything what He has done for us. May God bless you.